So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and it's been some time, has it not, since the last time that we saw Minas Tirith in action, this classic map. I don't think, in spite of how long it's been since we last saw Minas Tirith, there's not really too much need to go through the overall layout of the map, because I feel as though you could give this to someone who has not only not played Reforged, but not played any Total War, and they would probably be able to give you the layout of Minas Tirith with its snaking wedding cake-like layout as it leads up to the summit. There's of course a long way to travel from the base of the settlement right up to the top. It is by far and away, even though in terms of overall land mass that it utilises, I suppose there are bigger settlements technically speaking. Because of its layered nature, it is one of the biggest settlements that you can hope to try and take over as an attacker, though generally speaking the defenders do limit themselves to defending the first layer and then either just the initial choke point burst up here, which they will have to do this time because this is the version of the settlement where the town centre is mercifully on a lower level, or of course they can go right up to the top, which we have seen in the past. However, it's probably not going to happen this time, because having a look at the frames, I was thinking when I first got sent another Minas Tirith replay that we would be seeing another monstrously long battle replay, as Minas Tirith often tends to produce, but I feel as though the defenders are going to restrain themselves from retreating too soon up the layers here, and they're instead going to make a real fist of trying to defend the outer walls, trying to keep the foul forces of Mordor outside of the White City completely, based on the fact that it's actually a very reasonable length. By 5v3 standards indeed, this is actually a fairly swift battle in the grand scheme of things. Irregardless of that, we will be moving on to the attacking armies first and foremost, but it is worth just mentioning the fact that very likely the first layer is going to be the lion's share, if not all, of the battle replay today. A large crescent wall, a big gatehouse. The walls themselves can be somewhat easily overrun because of the amount of siege towers that can be put on them. Also, the walls can be knocked down in spite of their rather impressive size. They are destructible terrain. And that means the defenders may have their work cut out here, but because of how all of their reinforcements are going to be on hand, they should be able to readily plug any gaps that do appear. Anyway, we'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost, starting off with Dawaido Vader 25 playing as one of the Mordor armies on the attack. A classic army to besiege Minas Tirith with, to be sure. Orc Javelins, pretty much a no-brainer to bring in any situation as Mordor, I would suggest, because they're cheap enough to the point where you're not really going to be too upset, even if they only act as cannon fodder, both in melee and especially at range. However, they do have the ability to deal some decent damage, especially as it pertains to Gondorian defenders. Gondor, of course, are one of those factions in the game which armour piercing is never going to be going to waste, regardless of how Gondor build their armies. They're going to have to be leaning at least somewhat on their decent armour values. So any cheap and cheerful armour piercing that Mordor can provide, like these Orc Javelins, is going to be useful to some respect. And it also means that Gondor archers have a decision to make, generally speaking. Do they have to commit their ammunition to killing off a unit which is relatively cheap, and also there's quite a lot of them to go through? Or do you allow the Orc Javelins to get their damage done? Or do you have to... The third option is generally speaking the correct one, which is trying to find a creative way of killing off the Orc Javelins in melee, be that on the end of a cavalryman's lance or on the end of an infantryman's sword. In one way or another, that is the way that the defenders would choose to go about their business, but the attackers can make that very, very difficult for them indeed. Mordor Guard, which are a somewhat lesser seen unit from Mordor in all fairness, with the fact that they are a highly basic unit of spears on the same tier as the much more often seen Morannon infantry. They're fairly numerous. I mean, they're not the worst spear in the game in class by any means. If you have a look elsewhere in some other factions, stuff like, for example, the Dunman Spearmen from Rhudaur are going to be worse off than these guys, the Morannon Guard packing on more armour to keep themselves alive. But ultimately the reason why we don't see the Morannon Guard that often is because Mordor have cheaper spears in the Orc fodder, but also they've got better spears in the Minas Morgul Chosen, and generally speaking you do see that split between Mordor, going between those really low-end units and then the high-end ones, and any Morannon units they pack in the middle tend to be the infantry. But here we've got the Morannon Guard, so they will have the spear malice to contend with. They won't be all that effective against especially some of the stronger armoured units of Gondor, but they are reasonably numerous, and spears do have certain defensive advantages over their swordsman brethren. We have some Temple Inquisitors over here, someone striking a pose with his sword. Temple Inquisitors will make it far more difficult for the defenders to sally out with any sort of cavalry. Temple Inquisitors may not be multiple HP melee cavalry, but they will get the job done. In this current version of the game, they are reasonably expensive for what they offer, but if you don't have the money to dump into something like the Melkor's Chosen, then the Temple Inquisitors make a good option if you're hoping to try and stop any sort of sally outs with cavalry, and that's exactly what the Temple Inquisitors are here to do. If they're being used as mass pushing units later on, they're not going to get very far against spear focused factions like Gondor. Olag High, of course, if you can commit them at the right time, they're going to wreak havoc, and generally speaking, that's not going to be extremely early in the battle. You wait a little bit until the enemy is a little bit worn down, and then the Olag High, when the lines look like they're starting to falter, can be exactly the sort of thing to do a lot of damage. They of course have very strong armor-piercing attacks. They do need to be careful though. Gondor have more than one kind of unit which is going to be effective against them. Armor-piercing abound, but yes, the Olag High are really the best of the trolls in the current version of the game, and I believe they will maintain that distinction going into the next patch as well. Over here we've got some more armor piercing in the shape of the Sauron's Will, an upper end unit of heavy axemen. Like I said, armor piercing never going to go to waste against the Gondorians, so you may as well bring them. Just in behind them we do have the even stronger unit of shock infantry Mordor have. They don't have armor piercing, the Temple Executioners, but they are a very strong unit of heavy swordsmen, as we have seen several times in the past. Gondor, in this version of the game anyway, don't actually have an equivalent, though they will be regaining the vanguard of King Elisar in the next patch, but for now they don't have a heavy swordsman of their own. The Temple Executioners represent a very challenging opponent to try and bring down as well. More Sauron's Will on the other side of this unit of Blackguard of Barad-dûr. Bringing the Great Shield Infantry, especially in this version of the game, is a no-brainer if you're on the attack, because it gives you that mass pushing capability. Much in the same way as the Trolls, if you commit them when a line is starting to falter, they can start to bulldoze through and make the situation very difficult to recover for defenders, though not impossible. We have seen many times in the past Great Shield Infantry such as this start to be utilised effectively, and then the defenders reverse the tide, because in melee terms they're not the strongest in this version of the game anyway. More Orc Javelins, we've got some more Moran on Guard, and yet more Sauron's Will, so that's pretty much everything. An interesting composition, not your typical Mordor fare by any means. Sanket, let's see what he has at his disposal. Bringing a Troll Catapult. Troll Catapults avoid the slow weakness that many artillery have. The trolls that man the catapults are able to push their artillery very quickly across ground, and the main reason to bring them, of course, is to crumble the walls of Minas Tirith. Trying to poke as many holes in the defences here is going to be very important for the attackers. Yes, they can use siege towers, but holes in the walls are even better, because you're not restricted quite so much by the fact that you single file up onto the walls with siege towers, and also it allows you to push through a little bit more easily. Here we have the Orc Fodder. We already briefly mentioned them. Extremely cheap. They used to be completely free. That's not the case anymore, and it hasn't been for quite a while, but they are so cheap that they may as well be free, to be fair. They aren't very good in melee, of course. They are very much living up to their name as fodder in most matchups, but they are numerous, and they do allow you to field a big army with Mordor and spend a little bit of extra money on your higher tier units. We've got more Sauron's Will down there. We'll get onto them in just a moment. The Moran Halberds were an interesting omission from the last Mordor army we saw, because armor piercing is always going to be useful, and having a phalanx to anchor your infantry in place for the attackers as the battle wears on can be worth its weight in gold, though of course they are going to be very vulnerable to any Gondor missiles that may be coming their way. We've got some Olag High in the background. We saw briefly just a second ago the other two lower end, or mid tier I should say, Mordor units, the Orc Maulers, which when they have the armour upgrade they really join the Moranon ranks, to be fair. They're still very much a offense focused unit though. Their defensive values leave much to be desired even with the armour upgrade. Armour piercing, yes, but their own defensive values will probably leave them coming unstuck against the Gondorians unless they're well supported. The Moranon infantry, a dependable unit of line infantry for Mordor, certainly not up to the standards of something like the Uruk-hai infantry, but they are cheaper, allowing Mordor to field bigger armies, of course. Orc Fodder once again. Orc Archers are an interesting one. I mean, they're just going to be used to try and draw the attention of Gondorian skirmishers. Otherwise, the price for not engaging them in a skirmish fight is to allow the Orc Archers to get some kills, which the Gondorians really can't afford in a 3v5 like this. Orc Archers, though, I mean, Minas Tirith is somewhat more difficult for the attackers to use their skirmishers on. I mean, we've spoken a lot in the past few weeks about more open settlements being difficult for defenders to defend. That's certainly not the case with Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith is very heavily fortified, so attacking archers are more difficult to use here. Briefly, we also mentioned the Minas Morgul Chosen. This is the upper end unit of Mordor spears I mentioned. Very heavily armoured, very defensively savvy. Again, even with how they are a higher tier infantry unit, their spear malice does come into play here. They're not going to be the strongest at dealing damage to enemy infantry, but they will stay alive far longer than many of the other Mordor infantry units will individually, so they represent a very hard centre to a lot of the Mordor forces. More Moran on guard, more Moran on infantry, more Blackguard of Barad-dûr, more Orc javelins, and interestingly enough, punting for a unit of Uruk captains for their bodyguard, cheaper than Temple executioners. On a one-to-one basis, not quite as strong, but they do have a shield, making them a little bit more resilient to arrow fire, and they have armour-piercing attacks, so this I think is actually maybe the more savvy pick from Sanket, because the armour-piercing will be useful against the Gondorians, and saving that money has allowed him to bring a slightly bigger army. Then we have John Lemon, who is a player I haven't seen before, so that's good to see, playing as Rhun, the Easterling allies, which we scarcely got to see in the movie version of this battle. They were stood in the background, but never did we see them actually engage in melee. Still, they did give us this style of Easterling, which has become so synonymous with them. Loke Flagrim, a must-bring against the Gondorians, like I said, with the armour-piercing from the Uruk captains and the Sauron's Will. The Loke Flagrim, very dependable unit of line infantry, especially against armoured factions, such as are going to be on the defence today. We mentioned Halberdiers before, the Gamprin, very much the same sort of thing, only they are going to be a noticeable uptick in quality from the Moran on halberds we've already seen. We've got some Carmel's Chosen here, which are not too dissimilar to the Uruk captains, but they trade in the armour piercing for a little bit more in terms of their baseline stats and their defensive abilities. To be fair, I think I prefer the armour piercing in this kind of matchup, but the Carmel's Chosen are still very good, and Rhun have got fewer bodyguard options on foot anyway than Mordor have. Balcloth Tribesmen, once again, slightly more expensive than the Orc Javelins, but they are going to be individually better at their jobs, but again, it's much of a muchness really. They're very close to one another in terms of what they actually do functionally. Narrim, Dragon's Wrath crossbow is going to be an interesting one. I don't know how easy they're going to be to use in this kind of situation. We shall see. Body-piercing projectiles can be devastating, but they need to get in the right place to use them. Scion Rim, very similar to the Minas Morgul Chosen we've already seen, very defensively minded spears. Defensively, they are a notable uptick from the rest of the Runic army. However, they aren't going to have the same sort of killing power as the armour-piercing units that Rhun can field. Moving on, we have yet another force from Umbar, commanded by Adin Men. Umbar, a more high-tier faction by nature, but the Belagaya footmen are more basic. They do have the armour upgrade, but not going to have the most killing power against the likes of Gondor. We've got some Balakith Axguard here with the armour upgrade, armour-piercing. Like I said, never going to go to waste, and with the armour upgrade, they are going to be a little bit more defensively sound, and to be fair, the Balakith Axguard have got a surprisingly high melee defense for the kind of unit that they are. Heavy Axemen are always going to be somewhat limited in that regard, but still. Ardenheim Shield Guard, the Black Númenórean class units of the upper tiers of Umbar, are going to be locked morale. So the Ardenheim Shield Guard count themselves among that number, as do the Harbingers of Castamere, Castamere himself marching with them. Some Naran Iroh Guard are the archer version of the unit we've seen just now. They also have a spear in melee. The ever-dependable Alcarondas Legion is an upper-end unit of line infantry, and more shield guard, the javelins of the Corsair Blackguards, and then a couple of units of Belagaya pikemen to boot. And finally, last but by no means least, we have Khand, played by Wartels, and Khand I think are a good choice as well. I mean, they have abundant armour-piercing too, just like Rhun, and just like Rhun, their line infantry unit is one of the more dependable vectors for them to deliver that armour-piercing damage. The Nurad footmen, they have a better shield value than the Flagrim. The Flagrim are better slightly in every other respect, but the shield value is a significant factor when you consider what line infantry are usually used for, and they're going to be under arrow fire at some point in this battle, you would imagine, so those big wicker shields will be certainly doing their job. Traditionally, we see the Nurad footmen backed up by the halberds of the same name, and that's no different here. Again, very similar to Rhun, so it is very much the eastern way of things, I suppose, to have a shield and club infantry and then have some halberds to back them up. We have got some nomadic axemen, which are a cheap unit of axes. We've already seen the Orc Maulers offer something very similar for Mordor already. The Brotherhood of the Spear, combining the sort of Japanese samurai look with maybe a more human steppe nomad look. A very, very strong unit of spears here, kind of similar again to the Scion Rim and Minas Morgul Chosen we've already seen. The Brotherhood of the Sword are a little bit more unique in the fact they're a dedicated dual-wielding unit, which is somewhat of a rarity. The Brotherhood of the Axe will be delivering armour-piercing damage though, which, like I said, very useful. The Storm Guard, an incredible unit of bodyguard tier infantry there. Nomadic Marauders, and finally an interesting choice for the Brotherhood of the Wain here. I mean, if they can be used at the right time, they could be devastating, but it's a difficult ask for Wartels to use the Brotherhood of the Wain effectively here. Not only is pushing them through gaps in the wall going to be somewhat difficult because of how chariots spread out, but there's no way the defenders should be allowing chariots to run rampant in the first layer of the defence, but maybe. It's the sort of thing which is either going to pay off dramatically for the attackers and win them the battle, or be kind of a waste. Fortunately for the attackers, they aren't restricted quite so much by their losses as the defenders may very well be. Starting off here then with Winged Swordsman, who's the one who sent me this battle replay, so big thank you to him. Axeman of Lasarnak, Armour Piercing of Gondor's own, and yeah, it's going to be useful, at least to a certain extent, against all of the attackers today. Maybe a little bit less so against Canned, but even so, Armour Piercing here. Raven Helms, the non-Armour Piercing shock infantry unit, but of course higher base damage and better melee defense, so plenty of damage here up on the walls straight away, with some Wardens of the White Tower ready to back them up as well. A unit that I have underestimated in the past, even despite their bodyguard nature. Trebuchet, we've seen Trebuchets in this very position on Minas Tirith before be very, very effective, and the defenders will be hoping for more of that. Pelagia Marines are kind of basic as far as javelins go, and they are an uptick in cost in comparison to Orc javelins and the like, but they have the advantage of positioning here. The Pelagia Marines should be able to get some good shots off regardless. Some upgraded veterans of Osgiliath, locked morale, which could prove to be very, very useful in this kind of battle, and Gondor of course got plenty of heavy archers to choose from, so skirmishing with Gondor is going to be quite difficult, and to be fair, the attackers don't have that many archers. They may have tailored that based on the fact that Minas Tirith is difficult to use archers on, but Gondor may very well be able to use a lot of their ammunition freely, and the Athelian Rangers here, based on the fact we're still in the old version of the game on this replay, the Athelian Rangers are going to be one of the most key units that Gondor can use in this battle. We've got some floating barrels and such here. Fountain Guard, armour piercing in melee, as are the Citadel Guard. This is where Gondor really have their fangs. Very strong defensive units because they're spears, of course, and polearms respectively. But that armour piercing really does put them above and beyond. And then the bodyguard version of them, the Nimlothian Honour Guard, kind of the marriage of both of those two units in many ways. Very, very strong, adding yet more armour piercing to the Gondor front line. Marksmen of Caer Andros, Pelagia Marines, more of them. The Guards of Osgiliath, the only dedicated pike unit Gondor have, but it's a strong enough one to serve its purpose here. More Citadel Guard and Fountain Guard guarding the gates, unsurprisingly, with more Guards of Osgiliath and more bodyguard tier units just in behind. Loads of Axemen of Lasarnak from Darthy Darth here, who is one of the other players, and then Hertumihai represents the third defender here. Wards of Minas Ithil are an armour-piercing archer. They can be used to shoot stuff off the walls or from the walls, as long as they pick the right target. Could be very, very key as a unit. Fountain Guard, more Pelagia Marines, more Wardens of Minas Ithil, so plenty of them going into the red limit there, but it could very well be worthwhile given how damaging they can be against individual targets. Some unupgraded veterans of Osgiliath, which is an interesting choice, but they will still do just fine at their job. Citadel Guard, Marksman. Interesting to see, mostly they're going for the higher tier units. The standard Gondor fare we haven't seen too much of, but here is a unit of the regular Gondor archers nonetheless, but really no standard Gondor spearmen or Gondor swordsmen as such in this defence. Instead they're going almost entirely for shock infantry first of all, and then high tier spears and javelins and archers to back them up. I mean, this is a bold call because it means their army is going to be smaller than it already was going to be. There's going to be no room for error given the higher tier nature of the army they've picked, but it's got a huge amounts of damage dealing potential here. But positioning is going to be everything, and making sure that their lines don't collapse too quickly is also going to be key here. Interesting to see if this pays off. I'm going to make a small cut because the attackers do need to get onto the walls, but we're not going to have to wait too long, I feel, before the battle gets underway. So I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the walls of the White City are being assailed by evil. So we shall rejoin here, as it looks as though the Sauron's Will are going to charge down off the siege towers to engage the Gondorians that are on the walls, and pretty quickly here I think we are going to see the benefits of the Gondorians deciding to go so heavily in for their shock infantry instead of some of their more standard units of infantry, which with their shields and their lower costs could be seen as better in certain situations, but here, where missiles are far less of a concern outside of the catapult volleys that are coming in from the attackers, the added damage that these shock infantry units are going to be capable of doing is going to be important, albeit the Sauron's Will are also going to be able to give as good as they get in this situation, with their armour piercing being universally useful against the kind of Gondorian infantry units that we're going to be seeing. Meanwhile, the runic forces also coming forward. The ram finally as well is going to be joining in with all of the siege towers, but not the entirety of the attacking armies moving forward as perhaps I expected early on here. Brotherhood of the Wain still a far ways off. That's an interesting place to put your general as well, given that when you commit chariots you need to be highly aggressive with them, and they do have a tendency to fizzle out fairly quickly. It is rather interesting actually that there is just the one unit of infantry here that is engaging. With the Gondorians thus far. They've managed to kill off one half of the Caer Andros Ravenhelms. But the Sauron's will themselves are also shaking. They've actually done very well against the Ravenhelms of Caer Andros. I kind of expected them to have a little bit of an edge with that armor piercing that they have, but I didn't expect them to do that well against the two-handed swords. I mean, I do think that the Axemen of Lasarnak, generally speaking, are the superior unit. Orc Javelins trying to do a little bit of damage to the defenders that wait for the orcs up on the walls. They're managing to get some hits, but you may well be better off as Mordor trying to save your javelins until you have a good position on the walls to utilise them. That's what Rhun are doing, although Rhun maybe have jumped the gun a little bit by having their Balkoth tribesmen be the first unit that are being committed to the fray. They are most assuredly not going to be the sort of unit which can deal with Axemen of Lasarnak easily in melee, although the Gondorians allowing them to back up a little bit to the point where they can actually use their javelins, and now with some Scion Rim on the way forwards as well, the window of opportunity has actually closed somewhat for the Axemen to do a lot of damage to a soft, squishy target like the Balkoth. Meanwhile, the Flag Rim are up to the gate now. Over on this side of the battlefield, still no infantry units are scaling the walls just yet. I imagine this is going to change fairly quickly, as I've said in the composition phase. This isn't the longest siege of Minas Tirith that you could possibly see, which says that the defenders are going to defend from the front and the attackers are going to be more aggressive than perhaps we've seen on this map in the past. Quite a while ago, the last time we saw Minas Tirith though. Wardens of the White Tower on the front line, alongside some of the Axemen of the Sarnak that are just in behind, albeit a little bit more depleted. And we are seeing some of the downsides here right from the off of Gondor going so shock infantry heavy, in the sense that their infantry is dying off more quickly than it otherwise would. But Wardens of the White Tower will stand firm for a long time. I don't know where the Balkoth tribesmen are going now. Are they out of ammunition already? Getting in here in support of the Scion Rim, but with a little bit of archer support going up onto the walls as well. I can't imagine this is going to end too well for Rhun unless they're able to get more angles of attack. Moran on guard on the way forward to try and help what's left of the Sauron's will. I was a little bit surprised actually that there weren't more, well, there wasn't more support coming in from the archers down on the walls, considering the Sauron's will be weak to this sort of thing. But better late than never. The Moran on guard, a less important target to be sure, but the Orcs starting to get some decent numbers up on the walls here. And Rhun crashing through the main gate as well. More Moran on guard. What are Gondor going to do here? Because the Wardens of the White Tower could very easily end up surrounded here, even if it's only by Moran on guard. This isn't the sort of value you really want to be giving to the attackers in this kind of situation, especially not when you've got so many infantry units in reserve. That fight's still ongoing. The Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, the first ones into the fray over here. Again, an interesting choice. They have missiles that can be used first, which is going to be far more difficult to do if they're the first wave up a siege tower. And then in melee, they work better as a supporting foil to another unit. I find that high melee defense can make killing off a blob a little bit more difficult in pure melee terms. But when they're on their own, especially surrounded like this, the Gondorians should be just fine, and considering it's the Nimlothian on a guard as well, it's going to be a very big ask for Rhun to salvage that situation. Canned now following suit, the Nurad footmen routing in the face of the archers and the shock infantry really very, very quickly. The Ravenhelms having a bit of a better go of it over on this side of the battlefield than they were against the Sauron's will, but then the Nurad footmen are a little bit more defensively orientated, so that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Quick kills there, so the archers must have been involved. Maybe the ones of Minister Thiel shot a volley or two. Still a few more siege towers strewn about the battlefield. This is a little bit more serious though. We've already seen heavy axemen over on the other side, and the Saurons will do very well against the Ravenhelms of Caer Andros, and the Balakith Axguard are certainly not dissimilar in the background. You can just about see the catapult trying to punch another hole in the wall. Is it cunning to put a giant tower on the wall? You can see it coming from a mile away. Gamp Prim moving in as well, and these Nimlothian Honor Guard are pretty heavily surrounded at this point. Not ideal from their perspective. Ravenhelm still fighting hard, the Scion Rim struggling a bit, and most of this must be coming from archer fire. The Gamp Rim dying off very quickly in the face of a few volleys from the Wardens of Minas Ithil. So far, this battle entirely confined to fights upon the walls. The Moran Guard are of course going to really struggle against the kind of Gondorian infantry that are here. Javelins raining down from over the wall, trying to kill off some of the Pelagia Marines, but it's going to be the Gondorians naturally that hold the lion's share of effectiveness when it comes to utilising their ranged units, as you would expect. But they still haven't elected to utilise either the gap they've punched in the wall here. You can see some of the axemen of Lasarnak that fell from the walls when it crumbled. Nor have they decided to come in through the main gate just yet, but then there is a rather intimidating double-sided phalanx ready to close the jaws on them. The Gondorian wall surely is going to crumble here. Looks like they missed. That's unfortunate. More Nurads on the way up. Again, the armour piercing is useful, but it's a combination of factors here which is allowing the Gondorians to blunt the advances of the evil men over on this side of the field. Meanwhile, Balakith Axguard are shaken. Of course, it's only the upper crust of Umbar that benefit from the more liberal use of locked morale that Umbar have. The standard units, even the Balakith, do not have that locked morale, and they do stand a decent chance of routing under arrow fire like this. You can see that in melee terms, though, once again, they've been very effective against the Ravenhelm, so it goes to show heavy axemen are a very effective way indeed of dealing with the Zweihander unit that Gondor have at their disposal. Still no real intent to charge through the gates just yet. Instead, the siege towers maintain their position as the primary vector. Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen in through the gap there, come all Shadow Guard. We've seen heavy axemen be the focal point of both sides really on this occasion, and yet more of them joining the fray. Few kills inflicted on the Gondorians, but the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen will be forced back by the plentiful Gondorian archers. Another section of wall crumbles. Lots of archers waiting behind here. Orc Maulers, being as effective as the Orc Maulers can be in this kind of matchup. Certainly as an efficient, cheap unit, they're really going to struggle here. Surprised they haven't already routed actually under arrow fire, especially flaming shots, and surrounded as they are by the Gondorians. So yeah, there they go. Sanket not having the best of luck here now. The initial efficiency of those Sauron's will plays now a thing of the past. Over here, Orc Fodder are going to be charging in. Some of the Gondorian archers shooting into the backs of this position. Scion Rim as well, so Rhun and Mordor blending their units together, but it's not really a blend of strengths as such. It's two varying tiers of spearmen, and the Moran Guard showcasing their cowardice by fleeing. The streets now are a site of battle, which is something that the attackers need to be trying to enact a little bit more of, I think, as the Orc Fodder come forward, ready to engage more of the Gondorian infantry that they perceive. Gartos Gileath, a couple of units of them, and then some Citadel Guard. I mean, obviously anything Gondor have in melee is going to be sufficient for dealing one-to-one with Orc Fodder, but it's more about blanketing what parts of the settlement you have with your units from an attacking perspective. We've yet to see the defending trebuchet, but over in this part of the settlement the trebuchet isn't really a factor. It'll be more the main gate, and over on the other side with Umbar and Khand that will come more into effect. But so far the Gondorian front line's looking very solid. They're going to need to commit more on all fronts. And I feel as though timing here may be the issue for the attackers, because they're only committing units to attack the streets as their attacks on the walls are starting to fizzle out. If they had been a little bit more unified in their approach, I feel as though this would be the way to go, but as it is, I do worry for them actually over on the side of the battlefield. It's exactly the sort of situation that the defenders can really make work for them. You can see that the trebuchet seems to have hit these Umbarim, as they are also now trying to make their way into the city streets through the gap in the wall that their artillery has created. Balagai footmen are highly basic in terms of what they offer though. The Nurad halberds and the Balakith Axe Guard will be more of a concern, but this is where a lot of the Gondorian support units can come into play, including the trebuchet we've mentioned a couple of times now. Nomadic Axemen, very similar to the Orc Maulers we've already seen, but it is at least more units that can be committed to the fray. Still utilising... Oh, that's a very good shot from the trebuchet as well. A tiny bit of friendly fire perhaps on the Fountain Guard, but more than enough to justify that use. And javelins coming in as well, so this is going to be very painful, and so far the Gondorians setting themselves up nicely for the rest of this battle here. I mean, Rhun have got units that can be committed forward if Gondor decide to abandon the main gate and need to commit reinforcements elsewhere, but not enough to mount an assault against the current Gondorian defenders that are there. The Ravenhelm's having to go up against more armour-piercing units in a unit of Flag Rim. They're now trying to take the walls. It looks as though more Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen having to deal with a slew of Gondorians. They should do very well against Pelagia Marines in all fairness, but almost a complete reset required here. Only a few Moranon infantry are here to keep this assault going. So it's, yeah, they're really struggling a little bit to gain a significant foothold here, the attackers. More pikes on the way. Guards of Osgiliath will be very useful. You can see here that all of these archers forming up a nice defensive web in behind the infantry, and so far they've definitely been utilised quite well. More Sauron's will getting up onto the walls, and again in melee terms they have been good, but here with that added ranged support and the general survivability of the Gondorians, they get dealt with fairly comprehensively there. Elsewhere, victory seems certain for the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen. Still, a lighter Gondorian defence over here. They could do with more infantry units up here, perhaps, if they are to stop the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, but perhaps they're simply content to hold them at bay for a little longer and maybe hit them with a few more volleys from their archers. Pelagia Marines doing their thing still, and the javelins very, very effective. I mean, not tons and tons of kills, but this is one of the best uses for them, and it will bleed away at that attacking manpower, their primary advantage going into these kinds of battles. Still no action at the main gate. Still, the main way into the settlement for the attackers over here, doubling down on this gap in the wall by the looks of things, and this means yet more punishment at the hands of that trebuchet is going to be forthcoming. This is really vicious. Nomadic Marauders breaking, even the Mighty Brotherhood of the Sword, who've only just arrived, are breaking as well. I think this is a sign that the attackers should be looking at other ways forward, but I mean, at this point they've lost so much that maybe doubling down is the only way. The Runic General falls. So far it's all coming up the defenders. This is the sort of battle the defenders need to be seeing though in a 5v3 if they hope to have much success. Brotherhood of the Spear are a difficult unit to get rid of. They may not be as damaging as many of the other units the attackers have committed to the walls thus far, but they are going to be far more difficult for the defenders to drive back. Ravenhelms are still there. Another unit of axemen in reserve on the walls. Still the trebuchet fires in, and I mean the trebuchet is so devastating so far, and the Nurad Stormguard make for a very tempting target for any ammunition they may still have left. The Athelian Rangers are actually a little bit exposed. The Pelagia Marines stopping many of the Nurad Stormguard, but the Rangers are being engaged. But again, the Stormguard are so stretched at this point that you wonder how long that second hit point is actually going to keep them alive. And there are javelins nearby that can utilise their ammunition. The Mlothian Honour Guard can go toe to toe. That's a very nice hit from the trebuchet as well. The trebuchet is in the ideal position there, and artillery can be a fickle beast, but on this occasion it certainly behaved itself for the Gondorians. Still, these front lines maintain their position, not allowing the attackers a potential alternative through the main gate. Khamul Shadow Guard, once again we're seeing Pelagia Marines start to be utilised as the main infantry defender, and that's maybe a little bit more concerning because the attackers certainly have the tools to dispense with units such as that. The trolls moving forward as well. Nice damage spike, and that is exactly the sort of unit that will be good at breaking up blocks of units like the Guards of Osgiliath. They're going to need a little bit more support, I think, than just the Moran on guard. There are the Dragon's Wrath crossbow projectiles, which if they can get a few good hits, can certainly improve the attacker's fortunes. Sauron's Will are in here. Ooh. More hits from the Athelian Rangers. So far, this combination of defending polearms, very aggressive shock infantry, and plentiful archers has certainly done the trick, foregoing the basic units for the Gondorians thus far. Has been pretty good. Meanwhile, the Olakai charging through, perhaps trying to get at the archers in behind. They need to be a little bit careful though, because if they do overextend themselves, yes, the Fountain Guard are polearms, trolls traditionally good against them, but that armour piercing can make a big difference, and the Fountain Guard's stats as well are better than many polearms. As a result of their stats as two-handed spears, Axemen of Lasardak will be good against the trolls as well, so window of opportunity may be closing. The trolls, I think, are trying to retreat the trolls out of this fight, which is not the worst idea in the world. Over the last few months, when we've seen the trolls used effectively, it's been as shock troops that have been committed and then retreated and then recommitted again later, rather than just being left in melee to fizzle out. Some of them caught though. Blackguard of Barad-dûr thought about coming forward, in fact they did. Didn't yield the kind of results I'm sure the attackers were looking for, however. Guards of Osgiliath going to be attempting to skewer one of these Sauron's Will. And up here, Dragon's Wrath, still fighting hard, but with the support of the Ravenhounds, the Pelagia Marines should be able to turn the Gondorian fortunes back in their favour on the walls. And missiles, exactly the sort of thing which will be good against the Shadow Guard. Still, over here, rotting meat now being utilised, but considering the state of the morale of the attackers in this battle, may well be the best path forward. The Gondorians with their elite units will be far better at withstanding that morale debuff. Yeah, the attackers really are struggling to gain ground over here. I mean, it's not as if they haven't done damage to the defenders, but the mauling they've taken at the hands of all of the range support that Gondor have laid on for them is going to be fairly hard to recover from, I think. Go some way as to explaining why this is a slightly more condensed siege of Minas Tirith. Again, without too much in the way of support, the Brotherhood of the Spear have lasted a while up here in the face of high attack units. Brotherhood of the Shadows arriving a little bit too late, and also looks like they've been targeted by arrow fire as well. Ardenheim Shield Guard, I mean, they at least are locked morale, so even in this kind of disadvantageous situation they're in, they will be able to stand and fight for a long period of time. But surely, I mean, they've committed a lot here. Is the Brotherhood of the Wain ready to come in? More units arriving now. Alcarondas Legion, but there's not much left over here for Umbar and Khan, so they are running low, and they're not going to be able to defeat the Gondorians outright over here with just what they have left, so it's going to have to be if Rhun and the two Mordor armies can effect some kind of advance here, and they are trying to do so by all the available evidence. As we enter the final 10,000 frames, Dragon's Wrath crossbows have used their ammunition apparently, if they're being committed to melee, or perhaps it is possible that their expertise in melee is also somewhat required. Even so, their fate up on the walls is likely to be the same as all of the Easterlings that have come before them. More Easterlings advancing down the walls. That's a fairly large amount of halberdiers that the Gondorians are going to have to answer somehow. Not done yet, the attackers, but As the battle goes on with the lower amount of arrows that Gondor are going to have to work with, that could be the saving grace for the attackers. As the Blackguard of Barad do a rout in the face of the Nimlothians. I'm a little bit surprised actually that they were used as a siege tower unit. They can't really utilise their mass as easily in such things. Would have been better to have them trade places perhaps with this unit of Minas Morgul's chosen. Either way though, Nimlothian Honour Guard are going to have the better of that engagement. 8 Narim remain. They do have reinforcements ready. Well, there goes the Candice General. We'll head over there right now to see what the rest of the Brotherhood of the Wain can do. So maybe a little bit of a Hail Mary this. It's not difficult to see what they were attempting to do though. There's a cluster of Faramir's company here, the Warns of Minas Ithil and the Standard Rangers. So it's very understandable that they tried to get in here to stop them from firing, because this has been one of Gondor's most effective tools in this battle so far, but it was always going to end in tears. If they used the Brotherhood of the Wain aggressively maybe a little bit earlier, when they still have more infantry, it could have gone a little better, but I'm not sure. Alcarondas Legion here going to get the better of this battered and bruised remnant of these Axemen of the Sarnak, but they're only one infantry unit. They can try and link up with these Corsair Blackguards and Brotherhood of the Shadows, but the Trebuchet crew is on the way. Having already done their grisly work at range, they're now going to try and add to their kill count in more minor ways with their spears. And the Gondorians trying to clean house up on the walls now. And they will of course be successful. Citadel Guard, the armour piercing. Exactly the sort of thing to blunt the effectiveness of many of these Umbar units. Belagire pikemen marching into position as well. But at this point the Gondorians can afford to be a little bit more aggressive to try and bring down what remains. Of course our crossbows may be a little bit of a concern if you do get overly aggressive, but it's only one unit, and also counter skirmishing going on. The glass cannons that the crossbowmen of Umbar are not going to really enjoy being under arrow fire at all, as indeed have none of the attackers really. Gamprim are wavering in the face of the Citadel Guard. I mean, the phalanx could be the sort of thing to help equalise that fight, but it doesn't look as though that's going to be the case on the evidence of this. Further down, Dragon's Wrath crossbowman. What remains of them anyway. I mean, in melee, they should still have the beating of the Ravenhelms, even with a 12-man deficit, but it's going to be all of the arrows once again. Some flaming shot coming over the walls, presumably from the Narim. You get the distinct impression that there's not much more the attackers have to give. They maybe have one last go in them to try and break the back of the defence and really turn the momentum of this fight, but I'm not sure they're going to be able to do that. Orc javelins getting savaged as well, Athelian Rangers. The fact that there are still plenty of Gondor archers as well that have got enough ammunition to be a factor in this fight is a concern. Orc archers up on the siege tower. These Temple Executioners will be doing the business against the remaining Nimlothian Honour Guard, but maybe surrounding them with the Warns of Minas Ithil can bring them down as well. Even the mightiest of Mordor units here. There's still of course that unit of Temple Inquisitors hovering around. Another unit of Executioners. So they still have some quality, but I don't think they have the numbers to put around them, which is a rare enough situation for Mordor of all factions to be in, I suppose. Pelagia Marines, where are they going? Orc archers are still alive, so, and not routing, so you should really be trying to finish that job. Oh, hello. A counter-attack from the Gondorians out of the gates here. Marksman Caer Andros leading the way with one of the units of Warns of Minas Ithil. Again, the phalanx is a potential problem, but the Gondorians emboldened here, they're now going to try and sweep the enemy from the fields, given the strong showing they've had so far. In the background, Troll Catapult moving forward. Does that still have ammunition? Surprised it didn't finish the job of battering down that gate there.
Some of Umbar do remain. Naru Royal Guard moving over to try and help the Gamperim. That should turn the fortunes of the attackers in that little fight over there, but more of the Gondorians are on the way forward. Corsair crossbows, so there was a second unit of them actually, as the other one has been committed to melee, just being thrown in to see what they can accomplish before they inevitably perish. Further back, still units on the walls, another unit of Corsair Blackguards, more Alcarondas Legion, so perhaps able to cling on for a little bit longer than I was expecting here, Umbar, even if their fate is most assuredly already written. A few routing units as well. One unit of Fountain Guard is in reserve. I mean, it's not as if Gondor have got tons and tons of units in reserve. They have had to commit, as you would expect, most of their infantry especially to the fronts to keep things from falling apart. There goes one of the Mordor generals, the Wards of the White Tower, ripping him limb from limb. Oleg High's still alive, but they don't really have anything to break through to at this point. The Gondorians are fully willing to have all of their units act as infantry now. So it's not really going to work too well for them. I think that's going to be routing from the Orc Archers, fleeing from the scene, although these Temple Executioners will be successful in getting through these Wards of Minas Ithil, but they're taking a fairly consistent amount of damage as they do so. 3 Olag High, managing to survive the savaging. Troll Catapult does still have a bit of ammunition. Veterans of Osgiliath are up locked morale as well, let's not forget. Nice little feature that they have. Very much the epitome, really, of what Gondor are all about. A more defensively minded archer with a shield. Very, very useful defensively, as they have proven to be this time around. Although maybe it's the more damaging archers, I would say, from a Gondorian perspective, that have been the more important units here. As the Veterans of Osgiliath do overlap. And they are going to be going after the Troll Catapult. The Orc Javelins, of course, are terrible in melee, so stuff like the Pelagia Marines should be able to fairly comfortably deal with them. And then there's Orc Archers as well, getting repositioned, ready to try and offer a little bit of support, but most of the battlefield is falling quiet now, as the Gondorians spread far and wide to try and deal with what remains of the attackers. Again, maybe a little bit late in the day for the Harbingers of Castamere to be trying to lay down their effectiveness, especially in the face of all of the strongest Gondorian infantry as well. And then Citadel Guard moving in the support of these units. That's going to be the end of the Naru Royal Guard. Umbar's last stand will happen outside of the walls of Minas Tirith. Indeed, that's going to be mostly the situation, unless the Temple Executioners are the last unit left standing for the attackers here, I fear. So the defenders will be very pleased with how this has gone. Ultimately, they've managed to force the attackers completely outside the walls before the end of the battle as we see it. Still the Temple Inquisitors as well. That'll be a unit that Gondor as well will be a little bit concerned about, but Gondor of all factions, with all of their spears that are available to them, have all of the tools they need. Veterans of Osgiliath, I mean, the Troll Catapult, weak in comparison to something like the Olag High maybe, but they are still trolls. They are still going to do a fair amount of damage, and they're not the easiest unit to bring down. I really do like the Troll Catapult, actually, more for the speed that they're able to push their artillery across the field with. But also, this is the sort of thing which, when all is said and done, they're far more useful than a standard unit of artillery crewmen. Marksman of Caer Andros now moving across to take up the mantle of trying to kill off the Temple Executioners up on the walls. The occasional arrow coming in from the Wards of Minas Ithil, and the numbers discrepancy may well be enough for them to overcome the mighty Mordor warriors. And there's more Citadel Guard on the way as well, so with the surrounding action, this isn't going to be too hard. The Veterans of Osgiliath have been comprehensively beaten, actually, a combination of the Trolls and the Temple Executioners managing to do so, so they may very well be able to remount their artillery pieces here. I am not sure. Spears on the way. I'm surprised these Orc Javelins haven't routed, actually. Even if it's only Pelagia Marines they're in melee with, like, they're so poor in melee that the fact they're still going is somewhat impressive. Defeating the Naaru Royal Guard outside the main gate, the Harbingers of Castamere. Much like the Temple Executioners, it's just going to be a case of when they fall, but it's going to be more difficult to kill them off quickly, even with the level of Gondor infantry that they have over here. Veterans of Osgiliath on the way across as well. Victory is a distinct possibility for the Harbingers. Only 27 of them, but it will at least allow for a surround, taking that melee defense value away from them. Very important for a heavy swordsman. Yes, indeed, and I don't think it's going to change too much, so I mean, a little over 10% actually, the margin in favour of the defenders here, so the Gondorians, with a very good day at the office for them. Defeat seems certain. Last unit left standing, I imagine, is probably going to be the Temple Inquisitors, just based on the fact that they can avoid a fight for longer than a lot of these other units. The Orc Javelins finally rout. Made of sterner stuff, perhaps, than I was originally willing to give them credit for. Those Temple Inquisitors are going to be able to cycle charge in and defeat some of these more exposed units. These Orc Archers have probably gained a decent enough kill count for themselves, given the fact that they've been shooting completely unimpeded, really, back here. An admission of defeat. Castamere himself falls, unable to reclaim his throne. Temple Executioners holding up a little bit better, but then they're up against an easier melee opponent, and I say that, they're getting shot directly now, so that's probably going to be the end of them fairly quickly. The Orc Archers rout. So I think it's Dwido Vader's army that is going to be the last one standing. I'm going to try and cycle charge into the Gondorians here. I mean, off the charge, even though they're not a Lance Cavalry unit, they will still do decently enough. Though, of course, in prolonged melee, Citadel Guard are one of the best anti-cavalry units you could ask for. I'm just going to leave them in melee, I guess, which is sporting. He's not simply going to make the attempt of cycle charging over and over again. As the war cries ring out. Marks like Karandros, I mean heavy swordsmen as well. So just 18 of them remaining. Are the Temple Executioners really going to be able to outlast that? 17. They're not getting shot in the rear anymore though, so probably the Temple Executioners will be the last one standing, I imagine. Citadel Guard will be good against them as well, but not quite as good as they will be against their mounted brethren. There goes the General. So the Nimlothians also arriving in the background. Interestingly enough, some of the non-anti-cavalry units are kind of getting in the way of the Citadel Guard and the like from killing them off quickly. The Temple Executioners do rout though. And so the Executioners will be the last ones, fighting back to back up on the walls. And yeah, going to be a comprehensive victory in the end for the defenders, which is a rare enough thing. But I do think that the attackers, again, unity of their assaults, being really aggressive is nice, but positioning is everything there, and hyper-aggression is something that can certainly be punished very handily by artillery, and that was one of the main things we saw today. The Gondorian Trebuchet, extremely effective as well as their archers. So as much as I do like a very aggressive fight, I think on this occasion it worked against the attackers significantly, and the Gondorians had all the right tools and all the right positions to be able to counteract the attackers' aggression. And I think very deserved, the victory here. There can really be no doubt about that. As still 11 of them left. They're still eager as well, so is this going to be an admission of defeat perhaps, or are they going to start dropping like flies? Some Wardens of the White Tower arriving in here as well. Yeah, they are going to start dropping like flies now. There's another bodyguard unit up here to assist the armour piercing of the Citadel Guard. Very quick indeed. And there we go. Minas Tirith, the first layer. Walls are damaged. Of course, in reality, this is very likely to be merely the first wave, and the Gondorians are not going to have time to repair their fortifications for the next one, but they can afford to be very pleased with their day's work here, as I have said. We have, in terms of kill counts, the Runic army getting noticeably the most of the attackers. Maybe not too surprising. We did see them using their Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen. Generally speaking, they're going to have more armour piercing on average across their faction than the others, and that's, like I've said, just generally going to be very useful against Gondor. As for Gondor, again, we see one player standing out with Winged Swordsman himself getting the highest kill count, but I feel like that is largely down to the fact that he had the Trebuchet here, and that is definitely going to be bolstering his kills, as I'm sure we'll see when we look at the Gondorian kills in a little bit more detail from all three of the players. But yeah, deserved victory, that certainly. I think the attackers, a few things needed to be tweaked. The attack on the walls needs to coincide with the attack through the gaps they made. Instead, by the time the attack on the streets was taking place, the walls had already largely been lost, and they had to sort of reignite that attack, and that ended up being a huge drain on their manpower, and that really did tell, especially on the side of the battlefield with Khand and Umbar, albeit a lot of their misfortune was also inflicted by that artillery. But I feel as though after the first time that happened, they really shouldn't have doubled down on it. It's a situation where you need to rethink what you're going to be doing. And yeah, it was what it was, but difficult situation for the attackers. When you start into that downward spiral, the defenders can really start to grab a hold of battles. It's a rare thing, well, it's a slightly rarer thing to see in comparison to the usual way that a 5v3 will tend to go, which is even if the defenders start well, the attackers can tend to claim the momentum, and as soon as the transitional phases happen, that's where the attackers can really stick the knife in. But there wasn't any transitional phase here. And even if there was, to be fair, on Minas Tirith, it's a little bit more difficult for the attackers to take full advantage of. But yes, let's see what did the damage for Gondor. Plenty of units breaking 100 kills, some breaking 200, including the armour-piercing Wardens of Minas Ithil, Fountain Guard, Guards of Osgiliath doing quite well as pikemen, so that was definitely a wise investment indeed. Citadel Guard also doing well, unsurprisingly. Varying fates for all the shock infantry, considering the emphasis that was certainly put on them. In terms of the infantry, one of the units of Ravenhelm's doing quite well, but the other units may be struggling a little bit more. But there you see the Trebuchet, the main source of kills. The Athelian Rangers with only 131, but the Trebuchet was 622. And of course, that's not counting the kind of units that after the artillery had hit them, ran away. So obviously artillery can certainly cause a lot of routing, which isn't going to be picked up by that kill count as well. So thoroughly effective use of the artillery piece there. As far as Darthy Darth's army goes, Athelian range was 798. That's the sort of thing which is difficult to keep track of, but more effective in a direct sense than the Trebuchet even, in terms of kills. But that's not too surprising either. I mean, Rangers are very capable of getting these extremely high kill counts if they're put into the right position, and indeed it can prove, in the current meta of the game anyway, to be somewhat necessary for a defender to be able to get that kind of kill count with their Rangers, at least one of the players, and he has managed to do that. Indeed, it's the lion's share of his kills, really. No other unit even touched the 200 mark. A few breaking 100, though, with Nimlothians and Ravenhelms and the like. And then Hertumihai, a little bit more of an even spread for him. His best unit proving to be the Nimlothian Honour Guard, actually, was 378 kills, a very respectable unit. Even for one of the stronger infantry units that the game has to offer, it's still a very good return. Armour piercing as they are, marksmen doing well, and then several units also breaking 100. So yeah, nice to see Minas Tirith again, and actually nice to see Minas Tirith when it isn't a 70k frame monster battle, because invariably it will also always end in the same way, where it's a one choke point fight for at least half of that, and it's very difficult to commentate over such things. Whereas this, where there's constant action happening out on the outer layer, far better really, from my perspective anyway, when it comes to commentating on it. So big thank you to Winged Swordsman for sending this one in. Nice to see an old favourite once again. Big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. Several now very familiar faces that are, on many of the replays that get shown. As for what's going to be coming out next, it is actually another replay from Winged Swordsman, although it is one that happened a little while ago, in the sense that it is the Hidden Orc Valley map, which we've seen a couple of times already this year, so that will be the very next one to come out. I was also sent another replay from him, which I can't recall what the map was, but so basically there's going to be 2 Winged Swordsman replays coming up. There's also a few chaotic free-for-alls actually that have been given to me by the Womb Raider, so they will also be mixed in as well. There's also a couple of historical scenarios that were given to me by Lord of Belagost in Reforged as well, the disaster at Gladden Fields, and also Romendasil and his campaign against the invading Easterlings, so those 2, perhaps with more to follow as well. And then also there's going to be the mixing in of potentially a couple of Silmarillion battles here and there, which I think one was given to me by Captain Gervais. And then finally, there's always the spectre of the new patch, which is hanging over us, and the new version of Caer Andros, I'm sure, will be at some point. It may have already been uploaded even. If it's the sort of thing which when I get it, it will occupy the very next recording slot, and as I'm a month ahead of schedule at this point, I can't be sure when that'll actually be, but it may have already happened, or it may be imminent, who knows. The map is done, it's just a case of trying to get a really good battle on it, and that will once again be a Gondorian defence against a Mordor attack. That's the armies that they're trying to be going for there, and it's a very good version of Caer Andros as well, so I'm very eager to show it. There is also the matter of the channel update. I feel like most of this year, because of how far ahead in recording I've been mentioning this sort of thing at the end of battle replays, in the sense that I want to be doing a channel update to explain what changes are going to be happening, which look very likely now. It's not a surefire thing, but it is looking quite likely that things are going to undergo a bit of upheaval in a largely positive way. I think initially, if I do have my start date in January confirmed, probably until February 2023, the channel will probably be as it is at the moment, just sort of in its current form and going as it will. From February onwards, for the rest of 2023, I think I'll be given a little bit more wiggle room to do a few more things, including, hopefully, expanding out a little bit more and seeing what I can do with the channel in a few other ways. I mean, time is still going to be somewhat constricted, but certainly not as much as it has been over the course of 2021 and 2022. So, yeah, we'll see. There's definitely a few permutations, but it's definitely going to be a good thing for the channel. Whether it happens in January or it gets delayed a little bit to April, I'm not sure. By the time this replay comes out, I should have a more concrete answer for that. And that's why I will hopefully be doing a bit of a live stream Q&A to sort of let everyone know what's happening, and also hopefully then we can also take a look at maybe something from the next patch, maybe even if it's just having a cursory glance at some of the rosters that have been made for the upcoming patch from the likes of Ered Luin, Rovanian, Dol Guldur and the like. Any changes that have been made as well, we can go through some of that. And of course that does mean that something else which is hanging over us is maybe a repeat of all of the faction overviews. It's been a long time since I've done those, because it's been a long time since the current patch has been doing its thing, but we shall see. Again, enough rambling from me anyway. Big thank you to Winged Swordsman and all the players once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.